Have you ever wondered what happens when worlds collide in the most intimate and unexpected ways? What if I told you that during World War II, a specialized unit of Native American women recruited for their unique skills encountered something that left them more confused than enemy code? Modern American feminine hygiene products? This is the untold story of the Indigenous Women's Signal Corps, whose members faced not only the challenges of war and discrimination, but also a cultural clash that reveals shocking truths about both societies. Before you continue watching this incredible true story that's been erased from our history books, take a moment to comment where you're watching from and subscribe to our channel. We need your support to continue uncovering these hidden chapters of American history that show how different cultures within our own borders experienced life-changing moments during global conflict. The story begins in early 1942, as America's military desperately sought new ways to secure communications after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor. Military planners, remembering the success of the Choctaw Code Talkers from World War I, began recruiting Native American men for similar roles. What remains largely unknown is that a parallel program specifically sought Indigenous women from remote reservations for specialized communication and intelligence work. They came to our reservation looking for women who knew traditional ways but could also read and write English, recalled Dorothy Whitecloud, a Lakota woman from Pine Ridge, in a rare 1976 interview preserved in the National Archives. They said our unique perspectives would help America win the war. None of us really understood what that meant at the time. The program, officially designated as the Women's Signal Auxiliary Unit, but informally known as the Eagle Eyes, recruited approximately 78 women from 12 different tribes, primarily Navajo, Lakota, Cherokee, and Ojibwe. These women were selected not only for their bilingual abilities, but also for their limited exposure to mainstream American culture, a factor military planners believed would help them develop unbreakable codes based on Indigenous languages and worldviews. After selection, the women were transported to a specialized training facility at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where they encountered modern American life in ways most had never experienced. For many, it was their first time leaving their reservations. The cultural shock was immediate and profound. When they brought us to that base, everything was strange, said Mary Running Bear, an Ojibwe recruit, in a previously classified oral history recorded in 1963. The buildings, the food, the clothes, but nothing was as confusing as what they called female necessities. In our communities, these matters were handled differently, with natural materials and traditional knowledge passed down through generations of women. What Mary was referring to, in carefully chosen words appropriate for the era's sensibilities, was the standard-issue feminine hygiene kit distributed to all female military personnel, a kit containing commercial sanitary napkins, belts, and disposable products that were completely foreign to women from traditional Indigenous communities. Lieutenant Margaret Sampson, the white officer initially assigned to oversee the unit, documented the women's reactions in her personal journal, which remained in private family archives until 2004. The Indigenous recruits stared at the sanitary kits with complete bewilderment, wrote Sampson on March 8, 1942. When I attempted to explain their purpose and use, many seemed embarrassed, while others appeared shocked that such natural functions would be handled with commercial products. One woman, a Navajo elder of perhaps 40, asked why white women used paper and elastic when the earth provided everything a woman needed during her moontime. The moontime reference reflected traditional Indigenous perspectives on menstruation, often viewed not as an inconvenience to be hidden and managed with disposable products, but as a sacred time of power and renewal connected to natural cycles. In many Native American cultures, menstruation was associated with ceremonial practices and specific traditional materials made from plant fibers, soft hides, or moss that were not only functional but connected to cultural teachings about womanhood. What happened next would become one of the most unusual cultural exchanges of the war, one never recorded in official military histories. The indigenous women began sharing their traditional knowledge about feminine care with their white female officers, while simultaneously adapting military-issue supplies to more closely resemble their traditional methods. Captain Eliza Thornberry, who replaced Lieutenant Sampson in April 1942, demonstrated unusual cultural sensitivity for the era. Rather than forcing compliance with standard military protocols, she allowed the indigenous women to develop their own solutions, recognizing that their comfort and dignity would directly impact their effectiveness in their critical roles. I have made the decision to permit the indigenous personnel to modify certain personal supplies to align with their cultural practices. Thornberry wrote in an official but rarely seen report dated May 12, 1942. While unorthodox, this accommodation has significantly improved morale and unit cohesion. Furthermore, I have observed that several of their traditional methods appear more effective and comfortable than our standard issue supplies. This flexibility led to an unexpected development. The indigenous women began creating hybrid solutions that combined traditional materials and knowledge with certain aspects of commercial products. These innovations, which they called moontime wraps, used the absorbent cotton from military supplies but incorporated traditional design elements that the women found more comfortable and aligned with their cultural practices. Sarah Black Elk, a Cherokee recruit who would later become a nurse after the war, documented some of these adaptations in a personal journal discovered by her granddaughter in 2016. Today, I showed the others how my grandmother taught me to use certain plants that draw moisture away from the body. Black Elk wrote in June 1942, "We found some growing near the base. When we added these dried plants to the white women's cotton pads, they worked much better. Even Lieutenant Davis asked if I would make one for her after she saw how comfortable we were during training exercises." What began as a cultural misunderstanding evolved into a quiet revolution in personal care within this small, specialized unit. Word began to spread among other female personnel on the base about the indigenous women's innovations. Soon, white female officers and enlisted women were discreetly approaching members of the Eagle Eyes unit, asking about their modified supplies and traditional knowledge. Dr. Rebecca Johnson, a historian specializing in women's experiences during World War II, explains the significance. These indigenous women were inadvertently challenging deeply ingrained American attitudes about women's bodies. In mainstream 1940s America, menstruation was heavily shrouded in secrecy and shame, commercialized and medicalized. The indigenous perspective, viewing these functions as natural, sometimes even sacred, was radical in that context. Captain Thornberry, recognizing both the practical benefits and the positive impact on cross-cultural relations, made an unusual decision. In July 1942, she arranged for a formal knowledge-sharing session, officially documented as a specialized health and field hygiene seminar, in which the indigenous women taught traditional practices to interested female personnel. Today, we held what must surely be the first such gathering in military history. Thornberry wrote in her private journal, 23 women, including 3 nurses and a female physician, gathered to learn from our indigenous recruits about alternative approaches to feminine hygiene. The doctor, initially skeptical, admitted that some of these traditional methods were not only effective, but potentially superior to current medical recommendations in certain aspects. This extraordinary cultural exchange remained hidden from the mainstream military structure, documented only in personal journals and oral histories, both because of the taboo nature of the subject matter and because it represented a rare instance of white military personnel acknowledging the value of indigenous knowledge. The specialized training of the Eagle Eyes unit continued through the summer of 1942, with the women developing sophisticated communication codes based on their native languages. Like their male counterparts in the more famous Navajo Code Talker program, these codes would prove unbreakable to enemy intelligence. By September, the unit was deemed ready for deployment. Unlike the male code talkers, however, the women of the Eagle Eyes would not serve in combat zones. Instead, they were assigned to specialized intelligence facilities in the United States, primarily in Washington, D.C., and at Fort Meade, Maryland, where they worked intercepting and analyzing enemy communications. Even in these domestic assignments, the women faced significant challenges. Military facilities of the era were designed with little consideration for female personnel, and the Indigenous women continued to encounter cultural differences that tested their adaptability. The bathrooms were the worst, recalled Dorothy White Cloud in her 1976 interview. At home, we had such privacy for these things. Here, everything was open, with little metal boxes in the walls for disposal. Some of our women would rather walk half a mile to use the facilities in a different building than use those exposed stalls. The matter of feminine hygiene products continued to be a point of cultural disconnect. The supply officers, all male, could not understand why the Indigenous women consistently rejected certain issued items and requested additional cotton and other basic supplies instead. This led to tension and occasionally disciplinary notes about supply hoarding that failed to recognize the cultural differences at play. Lieutenant Grace Miller, assigned as a liaison officer to the unit in October 1942, finally addressed the issue directly with senior leadership. "I am writing to request specialized consideration for the Indigenous personnel regarding certain personal supplies," Miller wrote in an official memorandum dated November 3, 1942. "Their cultural practices differ significantly from our standard provisions. Rather than forcing conformity, I propose allowing monthly requisitions of basic materials that they can adapt according to their needs. This would improve morale, health, and operational readiness with zero additional cost to the military." Surprisingly, the request was approved, though with a note from Colonel Robert Williamson stating, "Approved on temporary basis for duration of current assignment, not to establish precedent for other female personnel. No discussion of specific details to be included in official documentation." This tacit acknowledgement of cultural differences represented a rare instance of military flexibility during an era when assimilation was still the dominant approach to Indigenous peoples. The women of the Eagle Eyes unit were being recognized, if quietly and partially, as both valuable military assets and as members of distinct cultures with their own valid practices. Throughout 1943, as their critical intelligence work helped guide American strategy, the Eagle Eyes unit maintained their cultural adaptations. What's more, their influence began to spread subtly among other female military personnel with whom they interacted. Nancy Rodriguez, a Mexican-American WSC, Women's Army Corps, member assigned to the same facility, wrote in a letter to her sister, "The Indian women here have shown me things my grandmother knew, but never talked about. They make their own monthly supplies that work better than anything from the commissary. Several of us have started doing the same. Somehow, they've made something we never discuss into something almost beautiful in its simplicity." This unofficial sharing of Indigenous knowledge continued throughout the war years, creating what historian Dr. Susan Blackhorse calls a subversive network of feminine wisdom operating beneath the rigid hierarchy of military structure. Women from diverse backgrounds, white, black, Hispanic, and Asian American, began adopting hybrid approaches to personal care based on what they learned from their Indigenous colleagues. It was like a secret society, recalled Elizabeth Chen, a Chinese-American translator who worked alongside the Eagle Eyes unit, in an oral history recorded in 1992. "We never talked about it with the men, or even acknowledged it in official settings, but among ourselves, these Indigenous women had started a quiet revolution. They showed us alternatives to the uncomfortable, Clinical products we'd been told were modern and superior. Many of us continued these practices long after the war ended. By mid-1944, as the tide of war turned in the Allies' favor, military leadership began considering how to utilize the Eagle Eyes unit in the Pacific Theater, where their specialized knowledge of code development might prove valuable against Japanese communications. A plan was developed to deploy small teams to secure facilities in Hawaii, Australia, and eventually the Philippines. This potential deployment raised new logistical challenges, including the matter of personal supplies for extended field assignments in tropical climates. Captain Margaret Wilson, who had assumed command of the unit in January 1944, approached the challenge directly. "I convened a meeting with the Indigenous squad leaders to discuss adaptation to field conditions," Wilson wrote in an after-action report discovered in the National Archives in 2001. "What I had intended as a brief operational briefing evolved into one of the most educational experiences of my military career. These women, drawing on generations of traditional knowledge, outlined comprehensive approaches to feminine hygiene in challenging environments that far exceeded our standard military guidance. The Indigenous women explained traditional methods used by their ancestors during seasonal migrations, hunting expeditions, and other situations where modern conveniences were unavailable. These included specific plants with antibacterial properties, natural absorbent materials that could be safely disposed of in field conditions, and practices that maintained hygiene with minimal water resources. Captain Wilson was so impressed that she took the unusual step of formally documenting these approaches in a classified field manual titled Specialized Hygiene Protocols for Female Personnel in Forward Deployment, a document that remained classified until 1997. Though the manual never explicitly credited Indigenous knowledge, comparing it with oral histories from unit members reveals that approximately 70% of its recommendations derived directly from traditional practices shared by the Eagle Eyes personnel. Dr. Martha Redbone, a medical historian who has studied this document extensively, notes, "This field manual was revolutionary for its time. It rejected the purely commercial approach to feminine hygiene that dominated American medicine, and instead embraced a holistic understanding that balanced practical needs with women's comfort and dignity." The irony is that this progressive approach came not from medical science, but from Indigenous traditions that mainstream American culture had long dismissed as primitive. Turkidi, in March 1945, as plans for Pacific deployment were being finalized, an unexpected development changed everything. A specialized Japanese communications code that had resisted conventional cryptanalysis for months was suddenly broken through the direct contribution of the Eagle Eyes unit. Sarah Walking Star, a Navajo member of the unit, noticed patterns in the intercepted Japanese transmissions that reminded her of ceremonial language used in certain tribal contexts, language designed to be understood only by initiated members. Working with 3 other Indigenous women, she developed an approach based on this insight that successfully decoded the Japanese system. This breakthrough, officially documented only as specialized linguistic analysis, provided critical intelligence about Japanese defensive positions in the Philippines and Okinawa, directly contributing to American military success and potentially saving thousands of lives. The classified nature of this contribution meant that the women received little public recognition. However, internal records show that General Douglas MacArthur himself was briefed on their achievement, responding, "If these women have found a key our best men missed, perhaps we should be listening more carefully to what else they might teach us." As the war in the Pacific intensified, a small contingent of the Eagle Eyes unit was finally deployed to a secure facility in Hawaii in April 1945. For these women, many of whom had never traveled beyond the mainland, the tropical environment presented yet another cultural shock and another opportunity to adapt their traditional knowledge to new circumstances. Mary Running Bear, among those deployed to Hawaii, documented their experiences in a journal that remained in her family's possession until being donated to the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in 2008. The heat and humidity here are unlike anything in Oklahoma, she wrote in May 1945. The military supplies for women's monthly needs are useless in these conditions. They deteriorate almost immediately. I have been showing the others how my grandmother taught me to use certain hibiscus fibers, which we found growing near our barracks. The local Hawaiian women use similar plants, though their methods are different from ours. We have begun exchanging knowledge. This exchange with native Hawaiian women represents one of the most fascinating aspects of this story. Indigenous women from the American mainland encountering and sharing wisdom with indigenous women of the Pacific, creating a bridge between cultures that colonial history had largely kept separate. Lilino Kawananakoa, a native Hawaiian woman who worked as a civilian translator at the facility, later described these interactions in a 1989 oral history. Those Indian women arrived knowing things about plants and women's health that my grandmother had taught me. Though we came from places separated by thousands of miles, we recognized in each other a shared wisdom that the military women seemed to have lost. We would collect plants together, sharing what we knew. Even with different languages, we understood each other on this matter in ways the white women could not. This cross-cultural indigenous exchange expanded to include Filipino women when several members of the Eagle Eyes unit were deployed to a forward facility in the newly liberated Philippines in July 1945. Here, they encountered yet another traditional knowledge system with its own approaches to women's health and hygiene. Maria Talchief, a Osage member of the unit, wrote in a letter home, "The Filipino women use plants similar to what my mother showed me as a girl, but prepared differently. They have been living under Japanese occupation with no access to American products, relying entirely on traditional methods. Their knowledge is extensive and practical. I find myself learning as much as I am sharing." As the war drew to a close following the Japanese surrender in August 1945, the women of the Eagle Eyes unit faced an uncertain future. Their specialized skills had proven invaluable to the war effort. Yet the rapid demobilization threatened to disperse this unique concentration of indigenous female knowledge and experience. Lieutenant Grace Parker, who served as the unit's final commanding officer, made an unprecedented recommendation in her debriefing report dated October 12, 1945. The specialized knowledge possessed by these indigenous personnel extends beyond their cryptographic contributions. Their traditional approaches to field hygiene, sustainable practices, and women's health represent valuable intellectual resources that should be documented for future female military personnel. I formally request allocation of resources to create a comprehensive manual before this unit is disbanded. The request was denied. Official correspondence discovered in 2006 reveals the reasoning. While these indigenous practices may have served a temporary purpose under wartime conditions, modern American women require modern American solutions. As these female personnel return to civilian life, they will need to readjust to contemporary standards rather than maintaining alternative approaches. This dismissal of indigenous knowledge reflected the broader post-war push to assimilate Native Americans into mainstream American society, a policy that would intensify in the 1950s with disastrous consequences for many indigenous communities. As the Eagle Eyes unit was officially deactivated in December 1945, the women were given two options: transfer to regular Women's Army Corps duties or return to civilian life. Military records indicate that 72% chose to return to their communities. They told us our special skills were no longer needed, Dorothy Whitecloud recalled in her 1976 interview. What they meant was that Indian ways of thinking, Indian ways of being women, had no place in their peacetime army. We had been useful when they were desperate, but now they wanted us to either become just like white women or go back to the reservation. The story might have ended there, with the experiences and contributions of these indigenous women fading into obscurity, were it not for an unexpected development in the Vietnam War era. In 1967, as American forces struggled with jungle conditions in Southeast Asia, an Army medical officer named Dr. Margaret Silverhorn, herself a Cherokee physician who had heard stories about the Eagle Eyes Unit, began researching alternatives to standard-issue feminine hygiene supplies that were proving problematic in tropical conditions. Dr. Silverhorn managed to locate and interview 17 surviving members of the unit, documenting their wartime innovations and traditional knowledge. Her resulting report, titled Indigenous Approaches to Field Hygiene, Lessons from Tuadutuan Native American Service Personnel, was submitted to the Army Medical Corps in January 1968. These women developed solutions 25 years ago that directly address the problems our female personnel are encountering today, Silverhorn wrote. Their approaches, based on centuries of traditional knowledge, are particularly relevant to our current tropical deployment challenges. We have been overlooking a valuable resource by dismissing these indigenous methodologies as primitive. Though never fully implemented due to institutional resistance and the taboo nature of the subject, Silverhorn's report did influence the development of new field hygiene kits issued to female military personnel serving in Vietnam. These kits incorporated several design elements and material choices that directly reflected the indigenous innovations documented from the Eagle Eyes unit. More significantly, Silverhorn's research preserved a record of the unit's existence and contributions that might otherwise have been entirely lost to history. Her papers, donated to the National Museum of the American Indian in 1995, provided the foundation for later scholars to begin reconstructing this remarkable story. In the decades that followed, as more military records became declassified and feminist historians began actively seeking women's overlooked contributions to the war effort, the story of the Eagle Eyes unit gradually emerged from obscurity. Oral histories from surviving members, collected primarily in the 1970s and 80s, added crucial first-hand perspectives. What these later accounts revealed was that many of the women had continued to be agents of change long after their military service ended. Returning to reservations and indigenous communities, they brought with them not only their traditional knowledge, now reinforced by its proven value in wartime conditions, but also organizational skills and confidence gained through their military experience. Sarah Walking Star, whose insights had helped break the Japanese code, returned to the Navajo Nation and established one of the first women's health collectives on any reservation, combining traditional knowledge with selective modern approaches. The clinic she founded continues to operate today, still guided by principles that balance indigenous wisdom with contemporary medicine. Mary Running Bear used her military communications training to establish a network connecting traditional healers across multiple tribes, preserving knowledge that was rapidly being lost as elders passed away. Her Native Women's Health Circle, established in 1952, created the first written documentation of traditional approaches to women's health from 12 different tribal traditions, knowledge previously transmitted only through oral teaching. Dorothy White Cloud, leveraging her security clearance and connections from military service, became one of the first Native American women to work at the Department of Interior, where she quietly advocated for indigenous healthcare approaches within the Indian Health Service throughout the 1950s and 60s. These women's post-war contributions, while less dramatic than their classified wartime service, arguably had an even more lasting impact. At a time when federal policies actively sought to erase indigenous cultural practices, they created mechanisms to preserve and perpetuate traditional knowledge about women's health and hygiene, knowledge that might otherwise have been lost within a generation. Dr. Elizabeth Tallbear, professor of Native American Studies at the University of Minnesota, explains the historical significance. These women stood at a critical crossroads in indigenous history. They had seen both worlds, traditional tribal communities and mainstream American military structure. Rather than simply accepting the narrative that indigenous ways were outdated and inferior, they recognized the value in their traditional knowledge, especially regarding women's health. Their quiet persistence in maintaining and sharing these traditions helped ensure their survival into the present day. The story of the Eagle Eyes unit and their cultural confusion upon encountering mass-produced feminine hygiene products represents more than just an amusing historical anecdote. It illuminates larger truths about the clash between indigenous holistic approaches to women's bodies and the increasingly commercialized, medicalized approach that dominated 20th century America. In indigenous traditions across North America, menstruation was often viewed through a spiritual and ecological lens. Many tribes had specific ceremonies honoring a girl's first menses as a sacred transition to womanhood. Monthly cycles were seen as connecting women to natural rhythms and cosmic forces, particularly the moon. The materials used for hygiene were often harvested with prayer and prepared with intention, creating a relationship with the natural world rather than producing disposable waste. The commercial products the indigenous female soldiers encountered represented a radically different paradigm, one that treated menstruation as a hygienic inconvenience to be managed discreetly, with standardized products designed for efficiency and concealment rather than harmony with natural processes. The clash these women experienced wasn't just about unfamiliar products, explains Dr. Susan Deer Cloud, a Mohawk anthropologist specializing in indigenous women's health traditions. It was about fundamentally different worldviews regarding women's bodies and their relationship to the natural world. What mainstream America saw as progress, disposable commercial products, indigenous women often experienced as disconnection from traditional wisdom and ecological balance. What makes this story particularly relevant today is the growing recognition that many indigenous approaches to women's health contained wisdom that modern medicine is only beginning to rediscover. The Eagle Eyes unit's adaptations, blending traditional materials with modern design elements, foreshadowed contemporary movements toward more natural, sustainable feminine care products. These women were eco-feminists before the term existed, notes Dr. Jennifer Redfeather, who has studied the unit extensively. They understood intuitively what science now confirms, that the synthetic materials and chemicals in many commercial feminine products can disrupt the body's natural processes. Their traditional alternatives often provided better outcomes for both personal health and environmental sustainability. In 2003, a remarkable discovery brought this historical narrative full circle. During renovation of a former military facility at Fort Meade that had housed the Eagle Eyes unit, workers discovered a sealed metal box hidden in a wall cavity. Inside were dozens of handwritten pages containing detailed instructions for creating what the women had called their moontime kits. These pages, written in English interspersed with words from various indigenous languages, provided comprehensive instructions for identifying and preparing specific plants, crafting effective designs from natural materials, and maintaining proper hygiene in various environmental conditions. Accompanying the instructions were small fabric pouches containing preserved plant specimens, a physical teaching aid created by women who feared their knowledge might be lost. Forensic analysis of the paper and ink confirmed the documents dated from 1943 or 1944. Handwriting comparison with surviving letters and journals identified the primary author as Sarah Black Elk, though several other hands contributed to the collection. This wasn't just a personal journal, explains Dr. Martha Redbone, who helped authenticate the discovery. It was a deliberate time capsule, a way for these women to preserve their knowledge for future generations. They suspected that both their military contributions and their traditional wisdom would be erased from official history, so they created their own historical record and hid it where it might eventually be found. The discovery attracted attention from both military historians and indigenous women's health advocates. In 2005, The National Museum of the American Indian partnered with the Women in Military Service for America Memorial to create a special exhibition titled Secret Knowledge: Indigenous Women in World War II. The exhibition, which later traveled to 12 cities across the United States, finally brought public recognition to the Eagle Eyes Unit and their unique place at the intersection of military history, indigenous knowledge, and women's health. For many visitors, particularly younger Indigenous women, the revelation of this hidden chapter in their history proved profoundly moving. "I always thought our traditional ways had been completely lost during my grandmother's generation," commented Jessica Running Horse, a 23-year-old Lakota woman, after viewing the exhibition in 2006. Finding out that Native women in the military actually maintained these practices and found them superior to modern products, even in the middle of a world war, changes how I see both our traditions and my own choices today. The story had a particularly powerful impact on Indigenous women serving in the contemporary military. In 2007, a group of Native American female service members deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan formed a support network explicitly inspired by the Eagle Eyes Unit. Calling themselves the Modern Moon Sisters, these women began sharing and adapting traditional knowledge to address challenges of military deployment in the 21st century. Staff Sergeant Lisa Whitefeather, a Choctaw soldier who helped establish the network, explained its significance in a 2010 interview. "Learning about these women from World War II showed us that we don't have to choose between our Indigenous identity and our military service. We can bring the strength and wisdom of our traditions into our modern roles. Sometimes the old ways offer better solutions than the standard issue approach, whether we're talking about health practices, environmental awareness, or even tactical thinking." The network eventually gained official recognition as a cultural support resource within the military, providing education about Indigenous perspectives and practical knowledge to both Native and non-Native personnel. By 2015, it had expanded to include over 300 Indigenous women serving across all branches of the armed forces. This contemporary revival of interest came as several surviving members of the original Eagle Eyes Unit were reaching the end of their lives. Between 2005 and 2010, oral historians conducted extensive interviews with the last 8 living members, creating the most comprehensive record yet of their experiences and contributions. These final testimonies revealed details that had remained hidden for over 60 years, including the extent of their cryptographic innovations and the full impact of their cross-cultural exchanges with Hawaiian and Filipino women. Perhaps most significantly, the women spoke openly about how they had strategically navigated military structures to preserve and adapt their traditional practices despite institutional pressure to conform. "We never directly refused orders," explained Mary Thunderhorse, then 93, in what would be her final interview before her death in 2011. "We simply found ways to adapt what they gave us into what we knew worked better. When officers questioned why we modified things, we would explain in terms of field efficiency rather than tradition. We learned to speak their language, not just English, but the language of military priorities. If we could show that our way improved readiness or performance, they would usually allow it, even if they didn't understand or respect the traditional knowledge behind it." This strategic adaptation, maintaining Indigenous practices while framing them in terms the military hierarchy could accept, represents a sophisticated form of cultural resistance that challenges simplistic narratives about Indigenous assimilation during this era. The women of the Eagle Eyes Unit were neither simply rejecting modern American ways nor abandoning their traditional knowledge, but rather creating an innovative synthesis that drew from both worlds. These women were cultural translators in the deepest sense, notes Dr. Elizabeth Tallbear. They could move between Indigenous and military worldviews, finding ways to preserve what was valuable in their traditions while adapting to new circumstances. This wasn't about clinging to the past or simply surrendering to assimilation. It was about creating something new that honored their heritage while engaging with contemporary realities. The full historical significance of the Eagle Eyes unit extends far beyond their wartime service or even their innovations in feminine hygiene. Their story challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between indigenous knowledge and modern American society, particularly the persistent myth that traditional practices inevitably give way to superior modern alternatives. In the specific case of feminine hygiene, the historical record shows that many of the indigenous approaches actually offered advantages that commercial products lacked. The natural materials used in traditional methods were often more breathable, less likely to cause irritation, and biodegradable long before environmental sustainability became a mainstream concern. Some of the plant-based components had natural antibacterial properties that helped prevent infections in field conditions. What these women demonstrated, explains Dr. Susan Deer-Cloud, was that indigenous knowledge wasn't a primitive stage to be overcome by progress, but rather a sophisticated system developed over thousands of years of careful observation and experience. In many ways, their traditional approaches were more advanced than the commercial products that were supposed to replace them, more anatomically appropriate, more ecologically sound, and more attuned to women's actual experiences. This revelation has particular resonance today, as growing numbers of women are questioning mainstream feminine hygiene products and seeking alternatives that better serve their health and environmental values. The shocking confusion these indigenous women experienced when encountering commercial products in the 1940s now appears less like a failure to understand modern convenience and more like a legitimate recognition of the shortcomings in these standardized commercial approaches. The story of the Eagle Eyes unit thus invites us to reconsider broader questions about progress, modernity, and the value of traditional knowledge in contemporary society. If these indigenous women were right about feminine hygiene, if their traditional approaches actually offered advantages that modern products lacked, what other indigenous knowledge might we be overlooking or dismissing to our detriment? In 2019, this question took on new significance when researchers at the University of Arizona discovered that certain plants traditionally used by southwestern tribes for feminine hygiene contain compounds with remarkable antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. Scientific analysis confirmed what indigenous women had known for centuries, that these plants weren't merely absorbent materials, but active therapeutic agents that promoted vaginal health. Dr. Rebecca Tsosi, who led the research team, emphasized the broader implications. What we're discovering is that indigenous knowledge isn't just folklore or primitive substitution. It's sophisticated understanding of biochemical and physiological processes, developed through careful observation over countless generations. Modern science is only beginning to validate what traditional knowledge holders have known all along. Sikabit, this scientific validation of traditional practices adds another dimension to the story of the Eagle Eyes unit and their initial confusion over commercial feminine products. Their preference for traditional methods wasn't simply cultural attachment or resistance to change. It was based on practical experience with approaches that, in many cases, genuinely worked better than the modern alternatives they were expected to adopt. As one of the last surviving members of the unit, Dorothy White Cloud, put it shortly before her death in 2009, "We weren't confused because we didn't understand the new products. We were confused because we didn't understand why anyone would choose them over what worked better. Only later did I realize that most American women had lost connection with traditional knowledge about their bodies. They had no choice but to use what companies sold them, because the wisdom of mothers and grandmothers had been silenced." This perspective invites us to reconsider who was truly confused in this historical encounter. Were the indigenous women failing to comprehend modern progress? Or were they recognizing limitations in mainstream American approaches that women socialized into commercial consumer culture had been trained not to question? The story of the Eagle Eyes unit and their encounter with American feminine hygiene products thus becomes more than an amusing historical anecdote about cultural difference. It represents a moment when different knowledge systems collided, when Indigenous women with intact traditional practices encountered the commercialized, medicalized approach to women's bodies that had become dominant in mainstream America. What makes their story particularly powerful is that these weren't isolated women from remote reservations encountering modern products as passive recipients of progress. They were military personnel actively serving their country, using their intelligence and traditional knowledge to contribute to national security at the highest levels. Their confusion about commercial feminine products came from a position of strength, from confidence in their own cultural practices rather than ignorance of alternatives. In the decades since World War II, the history of feminine hygiene has come full circle in remarkable ways. The disposable commercial products that confused Indigenous women in the 1940s became globally dominant, with traditional practices dismissed as primitive and unhygienic. Yet in recent years, growing concerns about health impacts, environmental sustainability, and corporate control of women's intimate experiences have led to a resurgence of interest in precisely the kind of natural alternatives that Indigenous cultures maintained. Today's menstrual cups, reusable cloth pads, and organic cotton products represent a modern rediscovery of principles that Indigenous women never abandoned. Principles of sustainability, body autonomy, and ecological connection. What was once dismissed as primitive is increasingly recognized as prescient. The women of the Eagle Eyes unit stand at a pivotal point in this narrative. Their strategic adaptations, combining elements of traditional knowledge with modern materials and designs, foreshadowed contemporary movements toward more holistic, sustainable approaches to women's health. Their initial confusion upon encountering commercial products wasn't a failure to comprehend modernity, but a recognition of limitations that mainstream culture is only now beginning to acknowledge. As we reflect on their remarkable story, their classified wartime service, their cross-cultural exchanges with other Indigenous women, their quiet preservation of traditional knowledge, and their strategic navigation of military hierarchy, we are invited to reconsider fundamental assumptions about progress, knowledge, and cultural difference. Perhaps the most powerful legacy of these Indigenous female soldiers is not just what they contributed to military intelligence, or even what they taught us about alternative approaches to feminine hygiene. It's how their story challenges us to question who defines progress and whose knowledge counts as advanced. It reminds us that wisdom comes in many forms and from many traditions, and that sometimes what appears as confusion in the face of modernity may actually be clarity about what truly serves human well-being. Today, as we face global challenges that industrial modernity seems increasingly unable to solve, from climate change to public health crises, the story of the Eagle Eyes unit offers a timely reminder that traditional Indigenous knowledge may contain solutions we urgently need to rediscover. The shocking fact isn't that Indigenous women were confused by commercial products. It's that it took us so long to recognize the wisdom in their confusion. As we conclude this extraordinary journey through a hidden chapter of American history, consider how many other Indigenous insights and innovations might still be waiting to be acknowledged. How many other shocking facts might reveal themselves to be profound truths if we open ourselves to different ways of knowing. For those who believe, remember that God's wisdom often comes through unexpected messengers. As Scripture tells us, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. The Indigenous knowledge that mainstream culture dismissed as primitive may yet prove fundamental to building a more sustainable, healthy future. The women of the Eagle Eyes unit served their country with distinction while honoring their cultural heritage. Their story reminds us that true patriotism doesn't require abandoning traditional wisdom. It may, in fact, depend on preserving it. As we face the challenges of the 21st century, perhaps we should listen more carefully to the voices our society has too often silenced, recognizing that ancient wisdom and modern knowledge, working together, offer our best hope for the future. The next time you encounter a modern convenience that doesn't quite seem to serve its purpose, remember the indigenous women who looked at commercial feminine products with bewilderment, not because they didn't understand, but because they understood something deeper that others had forgotten. Sometimes confusion isn't ignorance, but insight, a recognition that there might be better ways of living than what consumer culture presents as inevitable progress. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of those eagle-eyed women are watching us rediscover what they never forgot, that the wisdom of the earth and the knowledge of our ancestors contain answers to questions we are only now learning to ask.
At 0742 on March 6, 1945, Corporal Clarence Smoyer crouched inside the turret of an M26 Pershing tank in the rubble-choked streets of Cologne, watching a German Panther crew rotate their 75mm gun toward the intersection where two American Shermans had just stopped. 21 years old, 7 months in combat across France and Germany, 5 enemy tanks destroyed. The Panther fired twice. Both rounds punched through the lead Sherman's gun shield within inches of each other. 3 American crewmen died instantly. The commander tried to bail out, his left leg gone below the knee. Smoyer had grown up in Perryville, Pennsylvania, in coal country where his father worked the mines. He had never been in a fistfight. He had hunted exactly once, for rabbit, and felt sick afterward. Now he sat behind the gun sight of America's most powerful tank, watching smoke pour from a Sherman crew compartment 2 streets away. By March 1945, the U.S. Army had lost thousands of Sherman tanks to German guns. The Panther outweighed the Sherman by 10 tons. The Tiger weighed even more. German 75mm and 88mm guns could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges where American 75mm rounds bounced off German steel. During the Battle of the Bulge, 3 months earlier, American tank battalions had been devastated. Entire companies lost half their vehicles in single engagements. Crew survival rates told the story. If your Sherman got hit, you had seconds to escape before ammunition cooked off and turned 33 tons of steel into a crematorium. The problem had been obvious since Normandy. The solution had been delayed for 3 years. Army Ground Forces Command, led by Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, insisted the Sherman was adequate. Tank destroyers would handle enemy armor. American doctrine said tanks supported infantry and avoided tank versus tank combat. German doctrine said otherwise. So did battlefield reality. The Ordnance Department had designed a heavy tank in 1942. The T-26 program produced multiple prototypes. Each iteration added armor, improved the gun, refined the suspension. Each iteration also added weight and complexity. McNair's staff rejected every proposal. The Sherman worked fine in North Africa, they argued. Why fix what was not broken? By 1944, that argument was killing American tankers. The Battle of the Bulge changed everything. 400 German tanks, including Panthers and Tiger IIs, smashed into American lines in December 1944. Sherman crews fought bravely and died quickly. After the Ardennes, nobody could pretend the Sherman was sufficient. In January 1945, the first 20 T-26E3 tanks, later designated M26 Pershing, arrived at the Belgian port of Antwerp. General Omar Bradley split them between 2 veteran divisions, 10 to the 3rd Armored, 10 to the 9th Armored. The tanks reached a maintenance facility near Aachen, Germany, on February 17th. Division commanders sent their best crews for training. The Pershing had a different transmission than the Sherman, but similar controls. Each crew fired 28 rounds to familiarize themselves with the 90mm main gun. The flash was bigger. The recoil was harder. The noise made your ears ring even through the intercom headset. Smoyer remembered his first test fire. A farmhouse stood 1,200 yards downrange. Major General Maurice Rose, commander of the 3rd Armored Division, stood 20 feet behind the tank with his staff. Rose had ordered the target, the farmhouse chimney. Smoyer centered the reticle and pulled the trigger. The muzzle blast knocked Rose and every officer near him flat on their backs. The chimney exploded into fragments. Rose stood up, brushed dirt off his uniform, and grinned. Smoyer hit 2 more chimneys at longer range. Rose approved the Pershing for combat. If you want to see how Smoyer's experimental tank performed in the streets of Cologne, please hit that like button. Every like helps us share these forgotten stories with more people. Please subscribe. Back to Smoyer. The first Pershings entered combat on February 25th near the Rohr River. One was knocked out the next day by a hidden tiger, but others killed German tanks at ranges where Shermans would have been helpless. By early March, the 3rd Armored was pushing toward the Rhine. Cologne sat on the western bank, a major industrial city, Germany's 4th largest, now a wasteland of rubble and smoke. 262 Allied bombing raids had reduced most of the city to broken stone and twisted steel. Only the twin spires of Cologne Cathedral still stood, rising above the destruction like tombstones. On the morning of March 6th, Smoyer's crew received their orders. They would lead the advance into Cologne's city center. Their Pershing, one of only 20 in all of Europe, would be first through every intersection, first to draw fire from every hidden anti-tank gun. Rose himself had chosen them for the mission. It was supposed to be an honor. Smoyer touched the small Bible in his breast pocket and watched the streets ahead narrow into shadows. The Pershing lurched forward at 0800 hours. Staff Sergeant Robert Early commanded from the turret. Corporal John DeRiggi loaded the 90mm rounds. Private Homer Davis assisted on the bow machine gun. Private William McVeigh drove. Smoyer manned the main gun. They had been a crew since September 1944, fighting through Normandy hedgerows and Ardennes snowdrifts in a Sherman. 3 weeks ago, they received the Pershing. The crew named their tank Eagle 7 after the Philadelphia Eagles. Cologne had been Germany's 4th largest city, 1 million people before the war. Now perhaps 40,000 remained, hiding in cellars and subway tunnels beneath mountains of rubble. The streets were canyons of broken masonry. 3-story apartment blocks had collapsed into roadways. Tram lines twisted into the air like metal vines. Every intersection offered a dozen firing positions for German Panzerfaust teams. Every basement window could hide an 88mm anti-tank gun. The 3rd Armored Division had entered Cologne's outskirts on March 2nd. 4 days of house-to-house fighting followed. German defenders used the city's infrastructure against the Americans. Underground pedestrian tunnels connected basements across entire blocks. Soldiers called them mouse trails. German infantry would appear behind American positions, attack, then vanish back underground before anyone could respond. Snipers fired from church steeples and factory smokestacks. Anti-tank crews waited until American vehicles passed, then fired into the thin rear armor. The Pershing's advantages were obvious. Its frontal armor measured 4 inches thick, double the Sherman's protection. The 90mm gun could penetrate any German tank at combat range. But in urban warfare, those advantages meant less. A Panzerfaust fired from 20 feet away did not care about armor thickness. Molotov cocktails dropped from 3rd-story windows landed on engine decks where armor was thinnest. The Pershing weighed 46 tons. Many Cologne bridges could not support that weight. Streets that Shermans navigated easily became traps for the heavier vehicle. Smoyer watched through his periscope as Eagle 7 rolled past the remnants of what had been a shopping district. Mannequins lay scattered among bricks and glass. A streetcar sat overturned, its windows blown out. Fire had consumed entire blocks. The smell of smoke and worse things crept through the tank's ventilation system. Every 40 yards, the Pershing stopped while McVeigh checked for obstacles. Rubble could hide mines. Shell craters could break a track. The radio crackled with reports from other units. Sherman tanks were clearing side streets. Infantry squads moved building to building. German resistance was lighter than expected. Most Wehrmacht units had withdrawn across the Rhine during the night. The bridges were rigged with demolition charges. German engineers waited for the order to destroy them. Only rear guard units remained west of the river, volunteers who had sworn to fight to the last round. Eagle 7 rounded a corner and entered a broader avenue. The twin spires of Cologne Cathedral rose ahead, perhaps half a mile distant. The cathedral had survived the bombing through what many called a miracle. 262 raids had reduced the surrounding city to fragments, but the medieval structure stood intact. Its Gothic towers were navigation points for every unit in the city. Every map reference started from the cathedral. Every radio transmission mentioned the spires as a landmark. The Pershing advanced another block, then another. The streets grew wider as they approached the city center. More dangerous, too. Wide streets meant longer sightlines. Longer sightlines meant German gunners had more time to aim. Smoyer kept his eye pressed to the gun sight, scanning windows and doorways. His right hand rested on the turret traverse control. His left hand hovered near the trigger. At 09:15, the radio delivered new orders. German tanks were operating near the cathedral square. At least 2 Panthers confirmed, possibly a Tiger. American infantry had pulled back after taking casualties. Eagle 7 was to proceed to the cathedral area and eliminate enemy armor. Smoyer felt his mouth go dry. The Pershing had never faced a Panther in direct combat. Every crewman knew the statistics. Panther frontal armor was 5 inches thick. Its 75mm gun could penetrate 6 inches of steel at 1,000 yards. In North Africa and Normandy, single Panthers had destroyed entire American platoons. The Pershing's engine rumbled as McVeigh increased speed. The cathedral spires grew larger through the periscope. Somewhere ahead, German tank crews were waiting. Eagle 7 approached the cathedral district at 09:30. The streets narrowed again. Buildings that still stood rose 4 and 5 stories, creating urban canyons where sunlight barely reached the pavement. Smoky haze from morning fires drifted between the ruins. McVeigh slowed the Pershing to walking speed. The 46-ton tank made less noise at low throttle, but every revolution of the treads still echoed off the masonry walls. Smoyer rotated the turret slowly, covering the left side of the street, while Davis watched the right through his bow gun periscope. The 90mm main gun swung across storefronts and alley mouths. Empty windows stared back like eye sockets in a skull. This section of Cologne had been a commercial district before the war. Department stores, cafes, office buildings. Now it was a maze of collapse and shadow where any doorway could hide a Panzerfaust team. The radio transmitted in short bursts. 2 companies of American infantry were pinned down 3 blocks east of the cathedral. German machine gun fire from multiple positions, mortar rounds falling on their location. They needed armor support, but no Shermans could reach them. The approach streets were blocked by rubble. Only the wider avenue that Eagle 7 was following provided a clear path to the cathedral square. Another transmission came through. 2 Sherman tanks from F Company had attempted to reach the cathedral from the north. Both were operating without infantry support, dangerous in urban terrain, but F Company's riflemen were engaged elsewhere. The Shermans had orders to reconnoiter the square, identify enemy positions, then withdraw and wait for reinforcements. Early acknowledged the transmission. Eagle 7 would link up with the F Company Shermans near the cathedral. 3 American tanks could suppress enemy positions long enough for infantry to advance. Standard combined arms tactics. The kind of operation the 3rd Armored had executed successfully dozens of times since Normandy. The Pershing rolled past a burned-out German half-track. Its crew lay nearby, killed by American machine gun fire sometime in the previous 24 hours. Beyond the half-track, the street opened into a small plaza. A fountain stood in the center, dry and pockmarked with shell fragments. The avenue continued straight ahead toward the cathedral spires. At 09:47, Smoyer heard the sound through his headset. 2 rapid booms, heavy caliber, echoing from somewhere ahead. Then silence. Then a 3rd boom. Tank gunfire. Definitely tank gunfire. The characteristic crack thump of high-velocity rounds hitting armor plate followed a moment later. The radio erupted with frantic transmissions. F Company Sherman had been hit, crew bailing out, 2nd Sherman taking fire. German tank position unknown, but close to the cathedral. All units advised, Panther operating in cathedral vicinity. Early's voice came through the intercom, calm despite the situation. Eagle 7 would continue forward. They were the only American tank in position to engage. The F Company Shermans were likely destroyed or disabled. Infantry could not advance while a German tank controlled the square. The mission had not changed. Eliminate enemy armor. McVeigh shifted gears. The Pershing accelerated slightly. Still slow by open field standards, but faster than the careful pace they had maintained. Speed meant noise. Noise meant the Germans would hear them coming. But speed also meant less time exposed in any single position. Urban combat was a calculation of risks. Smoyer checked his ammunition. The ready rack held 6 90mm rounds within arm's reach. 3 armor-piercing, 3 high-explosive. DeRiggy had positioned more rounds throughout the turret, organized by type. In a prolonged engagement, they could fire 20 rounds before needing to restock from hull storage. Against a Panther, the fight would likely end after the first 2 or 3 shots. Either Eagle 7 would destroy the German tank quickly, or the German tank would destroy Eagle 7. Armor versus armor combat rarely lasted long. The street ahead curved slightly left. Beyond the curve, the cathedral square would be visible. Somewhere in that square, or on the streets adjacent to it, a Panther crew was waiting. They had already killed at least 3 American tankers. They knew more Americans were coming. Smoyer pressed his eye against the rubber cushion of the gun sight. His finger moved to the trigger. The turret traverse control felt solid under his right hand. Eagle 7 rounded the curve at 15 miles per hour, tracks clanking on the broken pavement, exhaust streaming from the engine grills. The cathedral spires filled the forward vision blocks. The cathedral square came into view at 09:52. The Gothic structure dominated the skyline, its twin spires rising 516 feet above the rubble. The plaza in front of the cathedral measured roughly 300 yards across. Once it had been paved with stone. Now shell craters and debris covered the surface. The Hohenzollern Bridge was visible beyond the cathedral, spanning the Rhine. German engineers had rigged it with enough explosives to drop the entire structure into the river. Smoke drifted across the square from fires still burning in nearby buildings. Through the haze, Smoyer could see the first Sherman. It sat motionless in the middle of a street that ran perpendicular to Eagle 7's avenue. The tank was angled slightly, as if it had stopped suddenly. Smoke poured from the open commander's hatch. The gun tube pointed skyward at an awkward angle. McVeigh brought Eagle 7 to a halt 1 block from the square. The Pershing sat in the shadow of a partially collapsed office building. From this position, the crew could observe the square without exposing themselves. Early studied the scene through his vision blocks. The Sherman had been hit at least twice, probably within seconds. Precision shooting. Professional gunnery. The German tank crew knew their business. The second Sherman was not visible from Eagle 7's position. Radio transmissions placed it somewhere on the northern edge of the square, also disabled. That meant the German tank, or tanks, had clear fields of fire covering multiple approaches to the cathedral. Any American vehicle attempting to cross the square would be targeted immediately. Early made his decision. He would reconnoiter on foot. Leaving the Pershing exposed and stationary was dangerous, but advancing blind into a prepared ambush was worse. He needed to see the German tank's position before committing Eagle 7 to the attack. He climbed out of the turret hatch and dropped to the street. An American soldier appeared from a doorway 30 yards ahead. Technical Sergeant Jim Bates, Army Signal Corps. He carried a 16mm film camera and wore a rucksack loaded with film magazines. Bates had been assigned to document the 3rd Armored Division's operations since Normandy. He filmed combat footage, interviewed soldiers, recorded the liberation of towns and cities. His footage appeared in newsreels shown in American movie theaters. Bates had been with an infantry squad when the first Sherman was hit. He had filmed the German tank's muzzle flash, the impact on the Sherman's turret, the crew attempting to escape. He had clear footage of the entire engagement. Now, he wanted more. The presence of an American heavy tank in Cologne was newsworthy. A battle between the Pershing and a German Panther would be extraordinary. Early and Bates moved forward together, staying close to the building walls. They reached a corner where they could observe the cathedral square without exposing themselves. Early scanned the plaza methodically. The disabled Sherman was clearly visible. Beyond it, partially concealed by a side street, he spotted the Panther. The German tank sat in perfect ambush position. Its gun faced down the avenue where the Shermans had approached. The 75mm barrel extended from the angular turret like a finger pointing at the kill zone. The Panther's crew had chosen their position carefully. They could cover the entire square while remaining partially hidden. Any American tank entering from the north would expose its vulnerable side armor. Early studied the geometry. The Panther could not see Eagle 7's current position, The building blocked their line of sight. But if Eagle 7 advanced into the square, the Germans would spot them immediately. A frontal engagement across 300 yards of open ground favored neither side. Both tanks had guns capable of penetrating the other's armor at that range. But there was another option. A side street ran parallel to Eagle 7's avenue. If the Pershing could loop around the block, they might approach from the west. The Panther's gun faced north. Its turret would need to rotate to engage a threat from the west. Turret rotation took time. Not much time, perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, but enough. Enough for one shot. Early returned to Eagle 7. He explained the plan through the intercom. They would advance down the parallel street. At the intersection closest to the cathedral, they would turn left and enter the square. The Panther would be to their right, roughly 90 degrees from Eagle 7's gun. Smoyer would have a clear shot at the German tank's side armor. The thinnest armor. The killing shot. McVeigh acknowledged. DeRiggi loaded an armor-piercing round. Davis readied the bowgun. Smoyer rotated the turret until the main gun pointed right, anticipating the angle they would need when they reached the intersection. The Pershing's engine revved. The 46 tons of steel began moving. Bates positioned himself in a second-story window overlooking the cathedral square. His camera was ready. Eagle 7 rolled toward the intersection where a Panther crew waited. Eagle 7 entered the side street at 09:58. The avenue was narrower than the main approach, barely wide enough for the Pershing's bulk. Building fragments littered the pavement. McVeigh navigated around a crater, keeping the tank moving at steady speed. Too slow, and they would be an easy target. Too fast, and Smoyer could not aim properly. The intersection ahead appeared through the driver's vision blocks. Beyond it, the cathedral square opened to the right. Smoyer kept his eye pressed to the gun sight, watching the angle where the Panther would appear. His finger rested on the trigger. The turret was already traversed 90 degrees right. When they cleared the corner, the German tank should be directly in his sight picture. Should be. Combat never matched the plan exactly. 50 yards from the intersection, 40 yards, 30. McVeigh maintained speed. The engine noise would alert the Panther crew. The Germans would hear the Pershing before they saw it. But sound took time to locate. Direction was difficult to determine in the echoing streets. The German commander would need seconds to identify the threat. 20 yards. The Pershing's bow emerged from the side street into the intersection. McVeigh's periscope gave him a limited view to the right. He saw the Panther immediately. The German tank sat exactly where Early had described, perhaps 110 yards away. The distance was point-blank range for a 90mm gun, but the Panther's turret was moving. The long gun barrel was rotating toward them. Someone in the German tank had spotted the Pershing faster than expected. McVeigh made a split-second decision. He did not stop the tank. Stopping would make Eagle 7 stationary. A stationary tank was a dead tank. He gunned the throttle instead. The Pershing lurched forward into the intersection, crossing the German tank's line of fire. Smoyer saw the Panther appear in his sight, the angular turret, the long gun, the dark muzzle swinging toward him. Every instinct screamed that he was looking directly down the barrel of a 75mm cannon that could penetrate his armor at this range. Training took over. Smoyer did not wait for the Pershing to stop. American tanks rarely fired on the move. The gun was not stabilized. Accuracy dropped significantly when the vehicle was moving, but stopping meant dying. He compensated for the motion, led the target slightly, and squeezed the trigger. The 90mm gun fired at 09:59 and 12 seconds. The armor-piercing round crossed 110 yards of open space in a fraction of a second. It struck the Panther's turret face just below the gun mantlet. The impact was visible even through the muzzle flash and smoke. A shower of sparks erupted from the point of contact. Metal fragments spalled off the interior surface, turning into shrapnel inside the crew compartment. Inside the Panther, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Bartelborth tried to process what he was seeing. The tank that had appeared in the intersection was too low and angular to be a Sherman. It looked almost German. He hesitated. Was it friendly? The question lasted perhaps half a second. Then the impact came. McVeigh brought the Pershing to a stop in the middle of the intersection, fully exposed now, no cover. but stationary meant Smoyer could aim properly. DeRiggi already had another armor-piercing round in his hands. The breech was open. He slammed the round home and locked the breech. Smoyer had not taken his eye from the sight. The first shot had hit high. Good hit, but not catastrophic. The Panther was still operational. He adjusted his aim point lower, targeting the hull side just below the turret ring. The Panther's side armor was thinner than the front, 40 millimeters instead of 80. The 90mm gun could penetrate 40 millimeters easily. He fired again at 09:59 and 17 seconds. The second round struck the Panther's right side, penetrating the armor plate and continuing through the crew compartment. The projectile exited through the left side armor, leaving 2 holes the size of dinner plates. Inside the tank, systems began failing. Hydraulics ruptured. Ammunition ignited. Bartleby threw open his hatch and jumped. He landed on the street behind the Panther, away from the Pershing. 3 other crewmen followed, scrambling out of hatches as smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. 1 man did not make it out. Smoyer fired a third time at 09:59 and 23 seconds. The round struck low on the turret, just above where the hull met the turret basket. Fire erupted from the impact point. Flames spread quickly, fed by leaking fuel and burning hydraulic fluid. Within seconds, the entire Panther was engulfed. In the second-story window, Jim Bates kept his camera running. He had captured the entire engagement. 45 seconds from the first shot to the Panther burning. The film showed everything. The Pershing entering the intersection, the German gun rotating, the muzzle flashes, the impacts, the crew bailing out. Smoker sat back from the gun sight. His hands were shaking. The Panther was destroyed. Eagle 7 was intact. Everyone in the crew was alive. The Pershing had proven itself. The Panther burned for the next 3 hours. Ammunition continued cooking off inside the hull, sending sparks and fragments into the air. By noon, the fire had consumed everything flammable. The turret sat at an odd angle, heat-warped and blackened. The bodies of German soldiers lay scattered around the cathedral square. Infantry that had been supporting the Panther had withdrawn across the Rhine when their armor support was destroyed. American troops moved into the area by early afternoon. Bates descended from his observation post and approached Eagle 7. The crew stood outside the Pershing, smoking cigarettes and checking the tank for damage. They had taken no hits. The Panther had never fired. Bartleborth's hesitation had cost his crew those critical seconds. Bates filmed the crew posing near their tank. Smoyer stood to the side, uncomfortable with the attention. By 1400 hours, additional American units had secured the cathedral area. Engineers began checking the Hohenzollern Bridge for demolition charges. Infantry squads cleared buildings methodically. Resistance was light. Most German forces had retreated during the engagement with the Panther. The sound of heavy tank guns in the city center had told them their defensive position was collapsing. But the battle for Cologne was not finished. German units still held portions of the city east of the cathedral. Isolated strongpoints needed to be eliminated. Eagle 7 received orders to continue the advance. The crew remounted. McVeigh started the engine. The Pershing rolled deeper into the ruined city. At 1432, Eagle 7 entered a narrow street 3 blocks from the cathedral. Buildings rose on both sides, creating a corridor barely wider than the tank itself. Ahead, the street opened into a small intersection. Beyond the intersection, the route continued toward the Rhine riverbank. A black automobile appeared suddenly from a side street, racing across the intersection. The car was moving at high speed, weaving between debris. To Smoyer, it looked like a staff car. German officers used similar vehicles to move between command posts. In urban combat, any unidentified vehicle was a potential threat. Civilians had been evacuated weeks ago. Anyone still in Cologne was either a combatant or supporting the German war effort. Smoyer opened fire with the coaxial machine gun. Tracer rounds streaked across the intersection. Several hit the car's body panels. Glass shattered. But the vehicle did not stop. It continued across the intersection, disappearing down another street. At the same moment, from a concealed position to Smoyer's left, a German Panzer IV fired its machine gun at the same car. The tank sat hidden behind a partially collapsed building, invisible to Eagle 7. Its crew had also spotted the automobile and engaged. The combined fire from both tanks raked the vehicle. The car jerked to a stop. The driver slumped over the wheel. A passenger door opened. A figure fell onto the street and did not move. Smoyer saw the muzzle flash from the German tank. A Panzer IV, older model, probably a Mark IV Ausf H. Not as dangerous as the Panther, but still capable of destroying a Sherman. Against a Pershing, the odds favored the American tank. But the Panzer's position was good. It had cover. Eagle 7 sat exposed in the street. The German tank began to withdraw, backing deeper into its concealed position behind the collapsed building. Smoyer could see only the front portion of the hull, not enough to guarantee a killing shot. The Panzer disappeared completely behind the rubble. McVeigh tried to maneuver the Pershing for a better angle, but the narrow street limited movement. The building that concealed the German tank was a 4-story residential structure. The front facade had collapsed, but the rear portion still stood. Interior walls were visible through the gap. The Panzer was somewhere behind those walls, repositioning for another shot. Smoyer made a decision. He could not see the German tank, but he could see the building. He rotated the turret until the 90mm gun pointed at the base of the standing wall section. The high explosive round in the breech was designed to destroy fortifications and buildings. He aimed for the corner support, where the wall's structural integrity was weakest. The gun fired at 14:34 and 48 seconds. The high explosive round detonated against the brick and concrete. The explosion removed a section of the corner support approximately 6 feet wide. For a moment, nothing happened. Then physics took over. Without the corner support, the entire wall section lost stability. 4 stories of masonry and wooden beams began to collapse inward. The building fell onto itself in a cascade of dust and fragments. Tons of rubble crashed down, filling the space where the Panzer IV had been concealed. The noise echoed through the street like thunder. Dust clouds billowed outward, obscuring visibility for several seconds. When the dust cleared, the building was gone. In its place sat a mountain of broken stone and twisted metal. Somewhere beneath that pile, a German tank sat buried. Inside that tank, 18-year-old machine gunner Gustav Schaefer and his commander had seconds to escape before the rubble sealed them inside. Schaefer and his tank commander clawed their way out of the Panzer IV through the turret hatch. Rubble covered the tank's hull. Dust filled the air so thick it was difficult to breathe. They scrambled over broken masonry and twisted steel beams, moving away from the American tank before more rounds came. The rest of their crew remained inside the buried vehicle, attempting to extract themselves through other hatches. Within minutes, all 4 crew members had escaped. They disappeared into the ruins, making their way toward the Rhine. By nightfall, they had crossed the river and surrendered to American military police. Eagle 7 continued operations in Cologne for another 2 days. The city fell completely to American forces by March 8th. Engineers secured the Hohenzollern Bridge before German demolition teams could destroy it, but other bridges across the Rhine had been blown. The cathedral stood intact, a Gothic monument rising above devastation. Bates's footage of the Panther engagement reached newsreel editors within a week. The film appeared in American movie theaters by late March. Smoyer's sister saw it at a local cinema in Pennsylvania. She recognized her brother and brought their parents to see the screening the following day. The 3rd Armored Division did not rest. By March 10th, they were advancing east beyond the Rhine, pushing deeper into Germany. Resistance varied. Some towns surrendered without fighting. Other locations required house-to-house clearance. The Wehrmacht was disintegrating, but isolated units continued following orders. Fanatics and SS troops fought to the death. Hitler Youth members threw themselves at American tanks with Panzerfausts. On March 30th, Major General Maurice Rose was riding at the front of a column south of Paderborn. His command style had not changed. He still led from forward positions, refusing to direct operations from a rear headquarters. At approximately 1800 hours, his jeep encountered a German tank unit that had broken through American lines. Tiger tanks blocked the road ahead. Rose's driver attempted to evade, but a Tiger commander cut them off. The German soldier emerged from the turret hatch and pointed a machine pistol at the jeep. Rose reached toward his holster, either to surrender his weapon or to resist. The German fired. Rose was hit multiple times and died instantly. He was the highest-ranking American officer killed by enemy fire in the European theater. His body was recovered the next day by elements of the 3rd Armored Division. Smoyer's unit was part of the recovery operation. Rose's death affected the entire division. Soldiers who had served under him since North Africa struggled with the loss. He had been a demanding commander, but fair. He had taken the same risks he asked of his men. His funeral was held at the Netherlands American Cemetery in Margraten. Thousands attended. The war continued. The 3rd Armored pushed east through April, encountering pockets of resistance that collapsed quickly once engaged. By late April, German units were surrendering en masse. The Wehrmacht had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. On May 7th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. May 8th was declared Victory in Europe Day. Smoyer remained in Germany through the summer as part of the occupation force. Eagle 7 was eventually shipped back to the United States for display and study. The Ordnance Department wanted to analyze the Pershing's combat performance. Engineers documented every scratch and dent on the armor. Ballistic experts measured the gun barrel wear. Maintenance crews noted mechanical issues. By September 1945, Smoyer received orders to return home. He sailed from Bremerhaven to New York aboard a troop transport. The voyage took 8 days. He arrived at Fort Dix, New Jersey for processing. Within a week, he received his discharge papers. Corporal Clarence Smoyer, United States Army, service number 334-90086, was released from active duty on September 24, 1945. He returned to Pennsylvania, to Lehighton, where his parents still lived, to familiar streets and people who remembered him as the quiet kid who had never wanted to fight. He found work at a cement plant. He married Melba Whitehead in 1946. They had 3 children. He rarely spoke about the war, but the war had not finished with him. At night, he dreamed about Cologne, about the cathedral spires rising above smoke, about the panther burning in the square, and about a black automobile racing across an intersection caught between American and German guns, about a figure falling from the passenger door onto the cobblestones. That image would haunt Clarence Smoyer for the next 68 years. For decades, Smoyer carried the weight of that moment, the woman in the car, the figure that fell to the street. He did not know who she was. He did not know if his bullets had killed her or if the German tank's fire had been responsible. He knew only that she was dead and that he had pulled the trigger. His wife Melba noticed the nightmares. He would wake up swinging his fists at enemies only he could see. The memories were so vivid that decades felt like days. His son Barry died of a heroin overdose in the 1970s. Melba developed Alzheimer's disease and eventually forgot his name. She passed away in 2017 after 71 years of marriage. The people who had anchored Smoyer's civilian life were gone. The war remained. In 1996, at age 73, Smoyer saw Jim Bates's footage of Cologne for the first time. A documentary about the 3rd Armored Division included the cathedral duel, but the footage also showed something Smoyer had never seen clearly during the battle: the black automobile, the machine gun fire, the passenger falling from the car, a woman, young, dead. The image confirmed what Smoyer had feared for 50 years. He had killed a civilian. The knowledge was crushing, but it also created a need for resolution. He wanted to know who she was. He wanted to apologize to her family. He wanted forgiveness, though he did not believe he deserved it. In 2013, at age 89, Smoyer returned to Cologne. A German journalist had researched the incident and identified the victim, Katharina Esser, 26 years old, the youngest of 4 sisters. She had cared for her parents while her sisters married and started families. She worked as a clerk in a grocery store and took night classes in home economics. On March 6, 1945, she and her boss had attempted to escape the city. They were caught in the crossfire. The journalist arranged a meeting at Esser's grave. Smoyer arrived expecting to be alone with his guilt. Instead, he found Gustav Schaefer waiting for him, the German gunner whose Panzer IV had also fired at the car, the man who had been buried under rubble when Smoyer collapsed the building. They were both 18 years older than they had been in 1945. Both carried the same memory. Both believed they had killed Katharina Esser. They met on the cathedral steps. Smoyer extended his hand. Schaefer took it. They walked together to the mass grave where Esser was buried, along with other civilian casualties. Neither man knew whose bullets had killed her. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. The chaos of urban combat made certainty impossible. What mattered was that they had both fired. They shared responsibility. They shared guilt. Schaefer placed yellow roses on the grave. Smoyer knelt to do the same and lost his balance. Schaefer caught him before he fell. Two old men who had tried to kill each other 68 years earlier now held each other up at the grave of the woman caught between them. They became friends. Letters crossed the Atlantic. Video calls connected Pennsylvania and Germany. They discussed the war not as enemies, but as men who had survived it and were trying to understand it. Schaefer died in 2017. Smoyer sent flowers to the funeral with a note, "I will never forget you. Your brother in arms, Clarence." On September 18, 2019, Clarence Smoyer received the Bronze Star for Valor at a ceremony in Washington. He was 95 years old, the last surviving member of Eagle 7's crew. The other crew members received their medals posthumously. Their families accepted on their behalf. Clarence Smoyer died on September 30, 2022, at his home in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He was 99 years old. Every March 6th since 2013, yellow roses have appeared on Katharina Esser's grave in Cologne. Someone remembers. Someone still apologizes. The panther still sits in front of Cologne Cathedral in old photographs, burning. The Pershing that destroyed it sits in the National Armor and Cavalry Museum. The film footage still exists, 45 seconds that changed how America understood armored warfare. But the real story was never about tanks. It was about men who went to war, killed because they were ordered to, and spent the rest of their lives trying to make peace with what they had done. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about tank gunners who never wanted to fight, but became the best at what they did. Real people, real heroism, real guilt, real redemption. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for making sure Clarence Smoyer and Katharina Esser do not disappear into silence. These people deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.